My name is Brooke Merritt, and I was 35 years old when my brother decided that being born a woman meant I had no right to the home where I grew up. 6 days after we buried our mother, Garrett changed every lock on the family house and threw my daughter's belongings onto the porch in the rain. Nora's sneakers were soaked through, and her stuffed rabbit was lying face down in a puddle. Garrett stood in the doorway and looked directly at me as though I were a stranger. Then he told me something I had heard my entire childhood. The land stays with the Merritt son. Girls marry out. You should have learned that a long time ago. He thought those words ended the conversation. He had no idea my father had left one final condition in his will, a condition that would eventually make my brother collapse in front of everyone. I grew up in Marietta, Ohio, a small river town where family names carried almost as much weight as money. The Merritts had lived there for generations. My great-grandfather started Merritt and Son Woodworks, and the old walnut sign still hung above the shop on 3rd Street. My father, Tom Merritt, ran that business for more than 30 years. He could identify different types of wood by smell, repair machinery without instructions, and build furniture that lasted longer than most marriages. People respected him. They called him traditional, hardworking, and old-fashioned. What they did not always understand was that his traditions had rules. And one of those rules was that sons inherited while daughters eventually disappeared into other families. My brother Garrett was 6 years older than me, and from the moment he was born, everyone knew what his future was supposed to be. Dad took him to the workshop after school and taught him how to read blueprints, operate machines, and work with his hands. I stayed home with Mom. She taught me how to cook, clean, organize, and keep the peace. Whenever property or the business came up, Dad repeated the same sentence. The land stays with the Merritt son. Girls marry out. He said it so often that eventually nobody reacted anymore. It became part of the background noise of our family. When I was 15, I asked Dad if I could work at the shop on Saturdays. He looked at me as though I had asked something ridiculous. He asked why I needed to learn a trade when I was eventually going to leave. I remember standing there with my hands in my sweatshirt pockets, trying not to let him see how embarrassed I was. I never asked again. 3 years later, I left Marietta with a duffel bag and a carpenter's pencil my father had given me when I was 9. He had once tucked it behind my ear and smiled before telling me that I finally looked like a Merritt. It was one of the few moments in my childhood when I felt like he was proud of me. I built my life somewhere else. I studied accounting at Ohio State and later earned a master's degree in forensic accounting. My career became about following money, finding hidden transactions, and uncovering fraud buried beneath complicated financial records. I was good at it, very good. By the time I was 29, I had started my own company, Merritt Forensic Group. It began with 3 employees in a rented office above a sandwich shop. Eventually, it grew to more than 20 people. I handled major investigations, worked with large corporations, and built a reputation for finding things other accountants missed. My family barely cared. Garrett called my work a calculator job. Dad called it something I was doing until I settled down. Whenever I mentioned a major case, he would nod politely and ask me to pass the dinner rolls. Eventually, I stopped talking about my career. I stopped explaining what I did, or how much the business had grown. I learned that sometimes the people who know you longest are the least interested in knowing who you have become. In 2023, I sold most of my ownership in the company while keeping a significant equity position. By then, my personal net worth had climbed above $5 million. I had built it without inheritance, without family money, and without anyone handing me a shortcut. I still drove my old Honda because I liked it. My family assumed I lived modestly because I could not afford anything better. I never corrected them. There was something strangely satisfying about letting people underestimate me when they had already decided I was incapable of becoming anything important. Then my father died. It happened suddenly. He was working at the shop on an ordinary Tuesday morning when his heart stopped. The paramedic said he was gone before he reached the floor. I received the call at my desk in Columbus. My hands were shaking so badly that my business partner, Gwen, drove me back to Marietta because I could not safely drive myself. Garrett was already in the family living room when I arrived. He was wearing a dark blazer and accepting condolences from people who knew our father through the Rotary Club and the woodworking business. He looked like someone who had been preparing for that moment his entire life. While he stood there receiving sympathy, I handled the funeral home, insurance companies, paperwork, certificates, and church arrangements. Mom was too devastated to function, and Garrett seemed more interested in being seen as the grieving son than doing the work that grief required. 14 months later, my mother died too. She had suffered a stroke while working in the garden she had maintained since I was a little girl. A neighbor found her among the marigolds. She died at the hospital a few hours later. I drove back to Marietta with my 7-year-old daughter, Nora, sitting silently in the back seat. She knew something terrible had happened, but she was too young to understand how much our family was about to change. At the funeral, Garrett delivered the eulogy. He spoke about our father, the shop, the family name, and what it meant to be a Merritt son. He talked about Mom's cooking and her garden. He spoke for 12 minutes and never mentioned me. After the service, my Aunt Carol pulled me aside and told me that Dad would have been proud of Garrett. I almost laughed. Instead, I thanked her and walked away. As I was helping Nora put on her coat, Raymond Voss, our family estate attorney, quietly approached me. He was an older man who rarely wasted words. He told me not to leave Marietta yet. Then he said something that changed everything. "Your father made changes to the will after Garrett's financial problems," he said. "Both of you need to be present for the reading." I asked him what Dad had changed. Voss only looked at me and said, "You will want to hear it yourself." 6 days after the funeral, Garrett called me while I was making oatmeal for Nora in my mother's kitchen. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask how Nora was coping. He simply told me that I needed to be out of the house by Friday. "The house is mine," he said. "Dad made that clear for 30 years. Probate is just paperwork." I reminded him that the will had not been read yet. Garrett laughed. "You know the rule, Brooke? The land stays with the Merritt son. You left, I stayed. End of discussion." Then I heard his wife Sloan in the background telling him that Friday was the latest they could wait because they wanted to start renovations. I told Garrett I was not leaving until Voss read the will. His voice changed. He became colder. "Then I hope you enjoy being homeless, Brooke. I made sure you get nothing." He hung up. That evening, I returned to the house and discovered that my key no longer worked. Garrett had changed the locks. When I walked around the back, I saw 3 cardboard boxes sitting on the porch in the rain. My daughter's clothes were inside. Her books were soaked. My mother's recipe tin was sitting in a box filled with rainwater. Nora's stuffed rabbit was lying face down on the wooden porch. Sloan opened the front door, wearing an expensive sweater and holding a glass of wine. She looked at me as though I had arrived at the wrong address. "Where is Nora's room?" I asked. "Garrett packed everything that belonged to you," she replied. "This really is not her home, Brooke. She's only visited a few times." Something inside me became completely still. I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I loaded the boxes into my car, buckled Nora into her seat, and drove away. We ended up at the Riverview Motel outside town. The room was small and outdated, but Nora thought it was an adventure. She wanted pizza and asked if she could jump on the bed. I said yes because I could not trust my voice with anything more complicated. I could have left Marietta that night. I had a condo in Columbus. I had money. I had a career. I could have driven away and never returned. But Voss had told me to stay. My mother had met with him before she died. And somewhere deep inside, I knew there was a reason. The next day I visited Voss at his office. He explained that my father had separated the 18 acres of riverfront land from the rest of the estate. The property included the old boathouse where Dad had once taken me fishing. It was worth approximately $1.1 million, and unlike the house and shop, it had no debt attached to it. Dad had placed a condition on the land. Both Garrett and I had to submit certified financial statements. The land would go to whichever child could prove they had enough financial strength to preserve it without placing debt against it for at least 10 years. I immediately understood why Garrett had been so confident. He had no idea what was coming. A few days later, I drove past the house and saw a banker speaking with Garrett on the front porch. Garrett looked nervous and kept insisting that the estate would cover everything once probate was finished. That was when I learned the truth. The house Garrett had claimed as his inheritance carried a massive second mortgage. Dad had taken the loan years earlier to rescue Garrett from financial disaster. Garrett had invested in several properties, borrowed heavily, and nearly destroyed himself financially. The house was not a treasure. It was a burden. That night, I finally opened the green metal toolbox my father had left me. Inside were his old hand tools, a small plane, measuring gauges, a coping saw. Beneath them was the carpenter's pencil. My initials were written beside his. TM to BM, Tom Merritt to Brooke Merritt. Then I found an old brass key. A metal tag was attached to it. boathouse. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I found a mortgage document beneath the tools. It showed the second mortgage on the family home. My father's signature was at the bottom. In the margin, he had written a short note telling me to ask Voss about the back acres. I called Voss that night. He explained everything. The house and shop were drowning in debt. The river property was the only significant asset Dad had managed to protect. He had finally realized that if Garrett inherited the river property outright, he would probably mortgage it and lose it. My father had spent his life believing the land belonged with the son. Apparently, near the end of his life, he had finally begun to question that belief. The next morning, Garrett submitted his financial statement. He called me afterward and sounded completely confident. "The land will be mine by tomorrow," he said. I stayed. I ran the shop. I carried the family name. Dad always knew who his heir was. I simply said, "Okay." Then I called Gwen. "I need a certified financial statement by 5 today," I told her. She laughed softly. "Brooke, I have been waiting for you to ask." Within hours, my financial statement was prepared and certified. My net worth was $5,830,000. I had no mortgage, no personal loans, no credit card debt, no hidden obligations. Everything had been earned through my career, my company, my investments, and years of disciplined work. The night before the reading, I sat outside the motel with the windows down and listened to the river. I realized I did not need the land, but I wanted it. Not because of money, because of what it represented. It was where my father had once taken me fishing. It was where I had felt like his daughter before he decided that being his daughter meant I would never belong to his legacy. The morning of the reading, Sloan came to my motel room. She brought a legal document and offered me $15,000. "Sign this," she said, "and Garrett will give you the money and all of Ruth's personal photographs. You release every claim to the estate." I looked at the papers. "You want me to sign away everything for $15,000? Sloan smiled. "It is generous." I folded the document and handed it back. "If Garrett has an offer, he can make it through Voss." She left angry. At 10 that morning, we gathered in Voss' office. Garrett arrived wearing an expensive suit and a Rolex. Sloan sat beside him. Aunt Carol sat quietly across the table. I sat opposite my brother with the brass key inside my bag. Voss opened the will. He read the standard provisions first. Then he reached the inheritance. "To my son, Garrett Thomas Merritt, I leave the residential property at 14 Maple Lane, the woodworking shop, and the homestead property." Garrett leaned back with a satisfied expression. Then Voss read my inheritance. "To my daughter, Brooke Ellen Merritt, I leave my personal hand tools and toolbox." Garrett smiled. He looked at me. "The land stays with the Merritt son," he said. Voss closed the folder. "Mr. Merritt," he said, "we are not finished." Garrett frowned. Voss opened the second folder. "Your father included a final section concerning the 18-acre riverfront parcel." The room went silent. Voss explained the condition. Then he opened Garrett's financial statement. He read the assets, then the liabilities, the second mortgage, the shop debt, the private loans, the credit cards. When he finished, he looked at Garrett. "Your verified net worth is negative $41,600. Garrett's face changed. "That is temporary," he said. Voss remained calm. "The condition requires financial capacity at the time of filing. Your statement does not meet that requirement." Then Voss opened my statement. He read my assets one by one. Company equity, investment portfolio, commercial real estate, retirement accounts, cash reserves. Then he gave the final number, $5,830,000. Nobody spoke. Garrett stared at me. Sloan looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Aunt Carol covered her mouth. Voss turned the page. "Under the terms of your father's conditional bequest, Brooke Merritt is the only qualifying beneficiary. The 18-acre riverfront property and boathouse passed to Brooke." Garrett whispered the number again. $5 million? $5.83 million, Voss corrected. Then my brother collapsed. His chair struck the table. A glass of water tipped over and spilled across the documents. Sloan rushed toward him while Voss called for medical assistance. I stayed in my chair. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I simply felt exhausted. For 35 years, my family had treated me like the child who would eventually disappear. Now the numbers had spoken for me. When Garrett recovered, he looked at me with something I had never seen in his face before. Fear. "You knew," he whispered. "I knew what I had earned," I said. "I did not know it would matter in this room." You hid it from us." "No, Garrett. You never asked." He started talking about everything he had sacrificed for the family. He said he stayed while I left. He said he carried the name. Before I could answer, Aunt Carol spoke. "I gave up 40 acres once," she said quietly. "I gave them to my brother because that was the rule. Boys keep the land. Girls marry out." Tears were running down her face. "That rule destroyed part of my life, Garrett. Your father was wrong. I was wrong for telling Brooke to accept it." She looked at me. "I am sorry." 3 months later, the Maple Lane house went into foreclosure. Garrett could not keep up with the second mortgage. Sloan moved out before the sheriff. Sale and took the modern cabinets she had installed over the originals. Garrett challenged the river property in court. Voss answered with the will, the financial records, and Ohio case law supporting the condition. The judge rejected Garrett's challenge. The decision was clear. My father's condition was lawful and enforceable. Garrett stopped calling me. Aunt Carol sent me a Christmas card. She did not write anything inside. She only signed her name. I kept it. Some apologies arrived too late to repair everything, but that does not mean they are meaningless. In January, I took Nora to the river property. The trees were bare. The river was gray and moving slowly beneath the winter sky. I stood outside the boathouse and pulled the brass key from my pocket. For years, I had believed the old key my father gave me was simply a key to the family home. It was never the house key. It was the key to the boathouse, the key to the land he had secretly separated for me. I turned it in the lock. The door opened. Inside were my father's fishing rods, his old chair, a coffee can filled with hooks, and the familiar smell of cedar. Nora ran toward the river and started throwing stones into the water. I sat on the boathouse steps and took out the carpenter's pencil. Tom Merritt to Brooke Merritt. For years, I thought that pencil represented the one moment my father had ever been proud of me. Now I understood it differently. Maybe it had been his final attempt to tell me that I had always belonged. I looked across the 18 acres and thought about everything that had happened. Garrett had inherited the house, but the debt swallowed it. He had inherited the shop, but he could not save it. He had spent his entire life believing that the family name made him entitled to everything. I had inherited a toolbox, a pencil, a key, and 18 acres of riverfront land. But more importantly, I had inherited proof that my father had finally understood the mistake he had made. A legacy does not belong to the person who demands it the loudest. It belongs to the person who has the strength to protect it. I eventually decided that I would build a small workshop on the river property for Nora. Not because she was a daughter who needed to prove herself, but because I wanted her to grow up knowing that her name would never determine what she was allowed to become. As I watched my daughter run beside the river, I realized something. I had not won because I was richer than my brother. I had won because I had spent my entire life building something that nobody could take away from me. And after a lifetime of being told that girls marry out and leave everything behind, I finally came home with the key my father had meant for me all along.